So good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to the launch event for the 16th edition of the REN21 Renewables Global Status Report. My name is Lily Riahi, and I will be your moderator today. For those of you who may not know me, I am the coordinator of the Pool Coalition, and I also oversee our energy and cities programs at UNEP, at UN Environment Program. So this year has really been dubbed by many, and not least the UN Secretary General, as the Make It or Break It year for climate action. And with energy accounting for 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, acting on energy and acting on climate are two faces of the same coin. So to give us a good chance at limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees requires an energy transition far larger and faster than any before it. And so today we will hear about our collective progress and how we can scale ambition and action at the speed required to deliver an energy transition in line with our climate and development goals. To get us started, we will first hear from Rana Adib, Executive Director of REN21, who will highlight the key findings from the 2021 edition of the Global Status Report. Please note there will be an opportunity to ask questions after Rana presents. So please do include your questions in the chat box. Some will be answered within the chat box, and some of them we will be taking and directing to Rana after her presentation. Following the discussion with Rana, we will have a panel discussion with three distinguished guests who are here with us today. Sam Kimmins, head of RE100, Dr. Birungi Kurutaro, CEO of Kilimo Trust in Uganda, and Robin McKellen, who's the non-executive director of Star Energy. We'd like to request all of you in the audience to actually keep your videos on, but muted, because it is nice to have an audience to speak to. And so now, without any further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Rana Adib. Rana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lily. Jessica, can you please stop sharing the screen, because otherwise I can't share mine. Great, thank you. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Lily. Make it or break it. I think this is exactly where we stand today, and is a very, very good introduction also to the Renewables Global States Report. Now, before starting on the report, I know that many of you here in the audience know REN21. But for the ones who don't know us, I think it's really good to just see where this information comes from. So REN21 is a global community of renewable energy players from science, academia, NGOs, governments, and industry. And we're all working together to really provide decentralized crowdsourced information and intelligence to inform, but also to influence decision makers, and not only decision makers in the energy sphere, but also outside of the energy bubble, so to say, because many of the decisions that are relevant for driving the energy transition and make the shift to renewable energy happen now are actually taken from non-energy players. So we're producing two annual publications. The Renewables 2021 Global Status Report is our historic publication. It is a collaborative annual reporting on renewable energy, which we're doing since 2005. And it's really crowdsourced because in this edition, we had more than 200 players participating in putting basically the different information together. The report looks into global trends, the policy landscape, market and industry developments, specifically also in distributed renewables for energy access, investment, and then the whole part on integration. So it's very clear that the shift to renewable energy means energy saving, efficiency, and renewables. And this year we had a feature specifically on the business demand for renewables. Now, make it or break it. 2020 has been disruptive. It's very clearly a year of new norms. And there are many, many new norms. but I would like to underline some. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impacts have created basically a certain environment. And I think very encouraging, it has been super encouraging to see that governments are able to mobilize. If there is a need, they're able to do their work. The other part is very clearly when we're looking into climate change that there has been very clearly a new ambition with net zero targets. We've also seen that there has been more and more pressure from citizens, civil society, courts even, because there was clearly also an awareness on this opportunity of clean air and skies, a bit symbolically. Just on the net zero targets, I think it is something where 2020 and the report shows it, we can step back on this new ambition. There have been many net zero targets announced in 2020 from national governments, subnational governments, corporations. And the reality is actually that possibly they are covering more than 80% of the global CO2 emissions. The reality is, however, that unfortunately, only 1/5 are actually in law. So this brings me to the next question. And considering the new norm, I'll try to tell the GSR story a bit differently. Walk the talk. So we have the ambition. Do we walk the talk when we're looking into government engagements? Here is an overview about the G20 countries. And the reality is they lack targets for renewable energy. From 20, and we look at the G20 countries because they are highest emitters and polluters. From 20 G20 countries, only 5 countries had an economic-wide renewable energy target. And of those 5, only 3 met those goals. There is very clearly the ambition, but there is a lack for a key performance indicator, which is basically the renewable energy share. Walk the talk in terms of targets. The reality is that there are 165 countries that have renewable energy targets. Most of it is on the power sector. When you're looking at the right side, so the yellow bright part is the target that have been achieved. When you're looking to the left side, these are targets that have not been achieved. And you can clearly see that there is a fundamental imbalance. And in particular, when we're looking into the heating and cooling sector, there have also been very little targets. Here there's clearly the ambition is stagnating. The other part is also, we see that the targets have been there. They have often not been reached. For more than 50% of the countries, they didn't reach their targets. And some of the countries that reached their targets did not renew the targets. So the ambition is not continuous and building up. And unfortunately, the situation on the policy and regulatory framework side is not different. So the message of the past has been policies for renewable power have been increasing. The reality is in transport and heating and cooling, they have stagnated in 2017 or even went down. So walk the talk. I think unfortunately the picture is a bit not so positive, or actually quite negative. Now the reality check. What happens in the markets? Investment in renewable energy is clearly a very important indicator. The good news is, and I think this is regardless of the economic crisis in 2020, the increases in renewable energy investment went up by 2%. Now, is this something positive? Yes, but IRENA and IEA clearly show that investment in renewable energy must at least triple on average by 2030 to reach the Paris goal, 1.5. Another aspect to underline here is that very clearly the realities of the countries and regions and the economic pressure are illustrated here. So in industrialized countries, the investment rose by 13%, very much driven by China, US, and when we are looking, however, into the developing world, the investment have fallen by 7%. I'm going to repeat myself. I think probably most of you know this figure. There is a sectoral disconnect. We are speaking about renewable power. It's very positive, and the share of renewables has risen here, 27.1%. In heating and cooling and in transport, the share again are kind of stagnating, and the investments here and the capacities need to clearly be ramped up. The reality is these sectors highly depend on fossil fuel. Fossil fuel remains to be subsidized in more than 115 countries. And as a result, we're clearly not on track. And then I think this slide is probably one of the strongest figure we have this year in the Global States Report, because it clearly shows that renewable energy has increased. This is basically the share of renewable energy in the total final energy consumption. In 2009, there was a share of renewables of 8.7%. It went up to 11.2% in 2019. That's the most recent data. When we're looking at fossil fuel, we moved it down from 18.3 to 80.2. So this figure clearly asks for a fundamental, quick structural shift. And it also underlined that it's not enough to support renewable energy. We need to stop building new capacities of fossil fuel, and we need to phase out fossil fuel capacities because the world is burning more fossil fuel than ever. Now, can renewable energy deliver? And this is clearly one of these questions with some critical persons are asking. And here, I think it's very clear that there is a very positive story to tell. Obviously, the renewable power sector showed that renewable energy can deliver. More than 250 gigawatt of renewable power have been added in 2020, even though there was the economic crisis. And what is very encouraging is that the capacities, for instance, in wind power and in solar PV, the assessment had been rather critical in the beginning of the year, but the industry associations, IEA, IRENA, have again increased basically their projections because the market have been extremely resilient to basically to the economic crisis. Renewable power has actually been the only power technology that had significant increases. And I think another very good story that shows that it's not about environmental impacts only. The corporate power purchase agreements have gone up significantly. So in 2020, there had been a growth rate on renewable power of 10% when we are looking into the capacities that are building on corporate renewable power purchase agreements. We have a growth rate of 18%. And this clearly showed that for corporations, it does not only make environmental sense, but clearly there are economic advantages in moving into renewable energy. And as a result, when we're looking into new power capacities, 83% of new power capacities have been renewable. So I think this clearly shows that the technologies are there and that it's also the least cost option. Today, it's cheaper basically in many countries to build renewable energy power, even compared to existing coal-fired power plants. Now, 2020 has obviously been a very important year. And with the COVID recovery packages, there is a major opportunity. And there was always this call for, let's make 2020 a year where we're changing the game. The understanding is clearly that the euro can be spent once, or the US dollar, or whatever money unit you want to refer to. So there has been a call for Green New Deals, for using the investment to basically build up the economies again, but also invest into resilient, so into climate change and resilient structures. The reality, unfortunately, is when we're looking into the COVID-19 recovery packages of 31 countries, the G20 included, the support for fossil fuel was 6 times more than renewables. And even though there is this positive story, this clearly feels like a very missed opportunity. And where we see that governments are not basically acknowledging the opportunities renewable present, not only in terms of building up resilient infrastructures, climate change, economic opportunities, job creation, etc. So what does this mean for the future? And what is the conclusion of the Global Status Report? It's very clear that we need to have the structural shift to renewable energy everywhere, in all energy sectors, in all energy consuming sectors. 2020 has been a year of new norm for ambition. And that is something we should really, really not step back on. It is, however, also very clear that setting net zero targets is not enough, that they are not binding and there is not a roadmap, will not get there. And the structural shift from fossil fuel to renewable needs to happen in all societal and economic activities, and it needs to be accelerated. This clearly means ending fossil fuel, not investing in any fossil fuel capacities, whether it is coal, oil, or gas. And it also means investing into energy saving, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. Now, what we clearly see is the vision does not seem to be enough, even if we share this vision. So REN21 is clearly calling for making renewable energy, and in particular, the renewable energy share, a key performance indicator, because we need to clearly move forward. It's about the performance towards a shared vision. And this needs to happen in policies, in any economic activities, in investment, and in any customer's decision even. And very clearly, when we're thinking about the structural shift that needs to happen, the renewable energy share is actually a very easy indicator. It's very transparent, and it is the right indicator to track the structural change and progress. So I think we collectively still have a lot of work on the plate to make it and not break it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rana. I think I personally have a question that I'd like to ask. You know, you spoke about the business sense, basically, of renewables, that it is cost effective in many regions and that it's good for the planet and the pocket, essentially. And yet you see this disconnect between making good business sense and being cost effective, and then the investment from governments in the, for example, COVID recovery packages that you were highlighting. Can you maybe elaborate on what your view is on why we see this disconnect?
So one aspect is very clearly, I think we see indeed that that new players are very clearly better acknowledging the fact that, for instance, investing in fossil fuel is a risk, and that we need to put a price on pollutions, on carbon, etc. And when we're looking into corporations, we also see that there is basically a question of resilience also, and reputational or management of reputational risks too, in addition to the economic part. I think this is something which is very clear the market is speaking here. The reality is, why do governments have such difficulties in moving here? I think there has been a clear focus very much on the energy supply side and less so on what is happening on the energy consuming side. Now, we see that there have been little targets and policies when we're looking into the building sector, into the industry sector, and into transport. These sectors are highly dependent on fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is still being subsidized in more than 110 economies, 115 economies, approximately by $500 billion per year. That's the least figures. And I just compare it again to $303 billion of investment in renewable power and fuel capacities. So this clearly shows a disconnect. We're not in a level playing field, but it's also an indicator of the fact that there is economic influence, let's say, or power dynamics that influence governments. And I think the encouraging part of the last couple of weeks in particular is that we see like more conservative players like IEA historically clearly state today that we need to move to net zero. And they also speak about the fact that renewable energy technologies are a key technology to look into. Technologies are there. We don't need major innovation during the next 15 years. And there is a very clear statement that we need midterm goals, but also that there is no need for new capacities, fossil fuel capacities. And the other part is, I think, the messages on Chevron, Exxon, Shell from the shareholders clearly show that there's also an understanding on the finance side and from the shareholders, and that they can influence also governments.
I think that leads a bit to your point also on the KPIs, right? In terms of, and you see the norms shifting. I mean, like you said, having these big players, Chevron, IEA, making that shift in terms of the norms and saying this is really a key part of the future has been important. And then, as you mentioned, the supply side being a key focus, where you see the shares of renewables largely on power and less on the sort of end-use sectors. So yeah, very, very good points. What do you see as the main barriers towards governments and other decision makers identifying renewable energy as a KPI?
One is clearly, and it was really interesting because we tried to see which governments really track the renewable energy share, and we had some interesting discovery that it's not always easy or integrated in the statistics and being calculated. What is really interesting is normally it's a quite easy indicator. So I think there is really a question of measuring it and the data and having the methodology, but also holding basically, and I think this is where it is interesting. It's this one indicator, and by tracking this indicator, we can hold anybody accountable for the actions and point to the gap or the progress basically in closing the gap between the ambition and the reality. So I guess to some extent there is a question of transparency also, and very clearly also the fact that there needs to be an understanding today that we're not speaking about building up slowly renewable energy capacities. We're speaking about a structural shift, which means like moving from fossil fuel-based economy to renewable-based economy. And this also means that it's today not enough anymore to track renewable energy capacities. And as we have also been doing as REN21, the policy, the targets, etc., but that we need to make sure that this societal and economic shift is happening. And I think this is clearly also, there is a reality that we're still operating a bit in silos, and that there needs to be a much stronger integration of planning, policies, target setting, and implementation.
Interesting. So getting ministries to actually put renewables into their planning and set targets across all sectors.
Yes. I mean, yeah. I guess to be honest, when I'm impressed, let's say, or negatively impressed when I see the amount of government that have net zero energy or net zero targets, and what is happening on the renewable energy side, because it is not really translating the fact that, as you mentioned it, Lily, the fossil fuel, the energy sector, represents 2/3 of the CO2 emissions. So if we're serious about these targets on the climate change side, then it clearly means that we also need to be serious about what is happening on the transition on the energy side. And this connection is not happening. And it's not only happening on the government side. When we're looking into energy sectors like transport, for instance, interestingly, we see that only 3 countries, for instance, link the e-mobility targets to where they get their electricity from. So there is very clearly a disconnect also between the different sectoral strategies.
And hence your point about the need for integrated planning and a holistic, comprehensive approach when looking at increasing renewables across the sectors. Just looking at the questions coming in, how do you see investment protection treaties influence on the energy transition? So for example, the Energy Charter Treaty that also protects fossil fuel investment. We have to get rid of them to make an energy transition possible.
I think we're today very clearly in a situation where, and this is also the new norms in terms of ambition also mean that we also need to redefine certain international trade agreements and new norms in our markets. And I think the Energy Charter is one of those examples. There is certainly another example when we're speaking about renewable energy, which is a decentralized energy too. Especially when we're speaking about developing countries, we see that there is an opportunity for local value creation. It's an opportunity for local jobs, it's an opportunity for economic opportunities, etc. And the feedback we hear very much from developing countries is that they are also struggling with the fact that they feel that there is a high dependence basically on industrialized countries' technologies, and that it's not always easy to basically put the local content into any agreement. So I think there is very clearly, when we're speaking about a just transition, an inclusive transition, and the reality is that renewables as a decentralized energy also mean that there are opportunities to create a new governance of energy, then to some extent it also means to reflect basically on some of the agreements that have been defined in a fossil fuel centered era.
And just you've mentioned, you know, the importance in the structural shift for renewables and really making integrated approaches happen to create that structural shift and sectoral collaboration. And so in your view, how important is it to focus in this sort of structural shift on the demand side and specifically connect with energy users, not only the producers, such as cities, for example?
Very, very important. And I think this is, so I did mention it, REN21 has now started to produce, we have just launched in March, the second edition of the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report. So I think when we're really looking into the players that are also ambitious and push for a more integrated approach, indeed, we see that cities and subnational governments play a key role. So we just had a discussion about Australia before. So when you see, for instance, the different orientations of the national government in South Australia, it is very interesting to see that basically other governance level can play a big role here. And often also, and I think specifically on the city side, when we're looking to the building sector and into road transportation, cities have a key role to play. And they are mandating, they have a regulatory mandate here. And for instance, their decisions and rules on banning fossil fuel in road transportation clearly has a key impact on many commercial fleets. So I think this is where the integration also becomes very interesting, because we see that there are other levers to drive the change. So this is one. The other one is very clearly, and I think Sam will probably go into this too, is the role of corporate energy consumers, where we also see that they are often starting for their own activities, but they also go down the whole supply chains. And another aspect is also, and I think this is where the KPI also comes in again, when we're looking into investment finance decisions, really bringing this transparency on environmental and social governance and indicators that can really avoid that we are not going into a greenwashing part, but really looking to sustainable investment. This is again another driver, which is in a cross-cutting sector and will touch upon the supply side, but also on the demand side.
So really changing our indicators is an important, changing our indicators, how we measure things, and also the agreements that come with that, like the trade agreements you mentioned earlier, and our governance structures. It is really a structural shift at multiple levels in society. And another question that's come in, you know, when you hear, well, a lot of developing countries, when you speak to them about the co-benefits of renewables, they say that's great, that's, you know, wonderful, but what about you? What are you doing as an advanced economy, for example? So what more can advanced economies do to, as you were saying, you know, walk the talk?
I think the first thing they should be doing is indeed walk the talk. And here we clearly see that there is a disconnect between the ambition, or the mentioned ambition, and what is happening. Now, what can governments do? I think the first part is, I'll build on the expression of the co-benefits. I think what we need to understand as energy players today is that actually energy is not always the main entry point for many decision makers. It can be air pollution, it can be health benefits, it can be job creation, it can be energy security, whatsoever. There are many drivers. And when it comes to making energy relevant to decision makers outside of energy, it also means to understand that maybe it's not important to convert them to an energy brain, I guess, but rather understand how energy can support them in meeting their agenda. So I think this is one really important paradigm shift that needs to operate. The other part now on the developing countries, and I think this is really the discussion in developing countries on the energy transition needs to be paused very differently. We are speaking about many countries here where the energy demand is still growing a lot, where energy access is a problem, and where the energy debate is about economic opportunities and social opportunities also. And with regard to this, or energy security, with regard to this, I think there are many opportunities linked to renewables, which are access to renewable energy on the short term. And when you're looking, so I didn't have time to go into this, but when you're looking, for instance, into the mini grid developments and the policy support here, there is an increasing understanding how important renewable energy can be in building mini grid infrastructure and building also different types of energy infrastructure. So that's one part. And the other part is that we basically need, again, to define the parameters quite differently, so that that access to finance, but also the assessment of fossil fuel investment will be evaluated in different way by governments in developing countries than the renewable energy part. And here again, the industrialized countries play a big role, especially when we're looking into the development banks and the finance sector. It's about divesting of fossil fuel also, and accompanying those countries to really make the investment in efficient and renewable energy infrastructure happen.
So really looking at the entry points, basically, when working with the different countries, because the benefits of renewables are so widespread that, like you said, it can be about access, very much about delivering access and energy services and economics, economic growth, and different infrastructure in developed countries, etc. So I just want to get to all the questions. There's so many questions coming in, so that's great. Are structural factors such as transmission capacity and laws regulating grid access more limiting to renewable energy expansion than limits to finance?
More limits to renewable energy extension than limits to finance, I guess. So maybe to online, I'm not a grid expert, so I'm if somebody from the team would like to jump in, that's really great. I think in general, the feedback here is very clearly that when we're speaking about an energy system change, very clearly the infrastructure needs to be built in. And I think that is something which is often missing. And it's also something which we see, for instance, when we're looking into the hydrogen discussion, we see that we all, or some players, put a lot of hope into hydrogen, not only for some sectors where it's really important to develop renewable hydrogen, but in general as crystal ball solution. The reality here is that we need to be very realistic about the fact what it means to move to a renewable-based system. And renewable-based hydrogen, for instance, means building up and ramping up renewable electricity, renewable power capacity directly. It means also building up grid infrastructure. And when we're moving to a renewable-based energy system, obviously it's not only about the capacities, but it's also about interconnection. Then again, when we're looking at the mini grid example, or island solutions, for instance, are really interesting here, because we also see that there are other ways of ensuring 100%, so 24/7, maybe not 25/7, but 24/7 energy supply, building on decentralized renewable energy system. So.
Thanks, Rana. I think you've given, at least I've taken many points of action that we can take forward in our work, each of us as organizations and individuals sitting around the table today, to try to turn around this maybe somewhat negative news you shared today about some of the investments in fossil fuels staying the same in terms of share of fossil fuels for the last 10 years, and turning that around and trying to accelerate action and raise ambition towards a renewable energy future. So thank you for that. And I think one of the most interesting points was indeed the idea of the using the share of renewables as a KPI. And so with that, I would like to segue into the panel and discuss with our panelists here how that impacts, how that could be integrated in their sectors. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so if I could ask our three guests today, Sam Kimmins, Dr. Birungi, and Robin McClellan, to turn on your cameras, which I guess I can already see your cameras are there. I see many guests on this, so great. So as I just mentioned, I think a really good segue into this discussion is to really consider what Rana has outlined about the use of renewables, share of renewables as a KPI in public and private decision making, and really using that to push for action, not just targets. So I'd like to ask each of you how you could see this being implemented in your line of work. Maybe I can start with you, Sam.
Hi, yeah, so thanks, Lily, and I want to congratulate REN21 on an incredibly thorough report. The pre-release copy landed on my desk at the end of last week, and 300 odd pages. Wow, that gave me a good weekend read. So congratulations on that report. And from the point of view of targets, leaping straight into that question, RE100 brings together 300 companies. Oh, sorry, over 300 now, 314 companies committed to 100% renewable electricity. And together, the demand of those companies exceeds the overall electricity demand of Italy. So, it's pretty sizable at over 300 terawatt hours per year. And having a target has been instrumental. It's fundamental to the success of RE100. And just to give an example of the success is that the president of the Taiwanese authorities, President Tsai, a couple of years ago in her industrial keynote speech mentioned that enabling RE100 companies to reach their 100% targets in Taiwan was critical to Taiwan's industrial success. So there is recognition that that this is happening, and businesses are really seeing that renewables aren't just about environmental success, environmental targets. It's actually about their future business success. In terms of the reason for that, renewables are actually cheaper than fossil fuel. The cost of solar was announced as the cheapest form of power in history by the IEA a couple of months ago. We're really seeing the change happening. So it's very easy to see in this report that split between what are the facts on the ground right now and the trends that are happening in future. And I think it can be very demoralizing in a way to look at the figures and go, well, the share of fossil fuels hasn't shrunk at all in 10 years. What you've got to look at is the underlying trends. And I can talk about those later, but I use the analogy, I was on the beach with my son at the weekend building sandcastles, and the tide is coming in. Fossil fuels are being outcompeted by renewables. Electrification is happening at scale. Electric vehicles are being driven by the market and will take over sometime in the 2020s from fossil fuel vehicles. That tide is coming in. So while the situation right now looks challenging, change is happening, and both the incumbents and the pro-renewables movement need to be aware of that. We need to take heart from that, and the incumbents should not become complacent simply because their castle made of sand appears safe on its nice platform of a stacked subsidy-based market. So things are changing. Targets will be absolutely essential. I've talked for quite a while. I'll leave it there.
Oh, very, very useful. I think to hear that all of these companies are really seeing renewables as not only good for the environment, but as you said, making very good business sense. So the point on incumbents really needing to perhaps use this measure of progress that Rana has highlighted, that REN21 has put forward, in order to make sure that they're keeping up with the times and able to actually, be the visionary organization, companies of the future. So point well taken.
Just to add a quick point on that, and one example of that is Japan, who has linked their NDC with a renewable electricity target. And by doing that, they've been able to not only plan uplift their NDC as they realize that actually renewables are becoming cheaper, they've been able to make a clear link between the two. But also there's been a virtuous cycle. As more and more companies in Japan, 60 so far, commit to RE100, 100% renewables, the Japanese government is seeing a market for renewables. They're able to link their renewable target to that growing market, therefore uplift their NDC. And so that having a target and linking it overall has been incredibly powerful. They need to go further and faster, but at least the process is in place now.
That's a great example. That's a great example of the connection between also governments raising ambition and making that connection, like you said, to the NDC, and then having an impact also with the companies continuing to also raise the ambition. So it's really a collaboration, isn't it, on renewables between all stakeholders, and particularly state action and businesses. I think I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Biringi from Kilimo Trust, to actually ask you how you think that having these using share of renewables as a KPI could be implemented in your sector. You're working in the agricultural sector, and would be interested to hear how you think this could be taken up.
Thank you, Lily, and I also want to add my voice onto an excellent report that has been done by the team. Just before I delve into that, I just thought that I think it is a challenging discussion in the sense that countries at different levels of development and their priorities are different. So for instance, the East African perspective, I could tell you, is government is also on the one hand building an East African crude oil pipeline of 1,450 kilometers, and at the same time also promoting renewable energy. So there is competing priorities at national level, and I think for that the commitment from government is key. But that said, in the agricultural sector, governments in East Africa are promoting what we call climate smart agriculture, cyclic value chains, not just for income and food security, but also to promote biofuels. And I'll just give you an example of one of the kind of scenarios that we are promoting in East Africa as an organization, and that is in the rice value chains. So we are seeing how we can integrate crop and livestock. For instance, how you can use rice straws for hay, and that can still be used because for livestock, biodigesters can then be with the dung from in the biodigesters can create gas and cooking gas, and that cooking gas still is clean energy, and the slurry goes back into restoring the nutrients in the soil. So we have seen that happening in rice farming households, and we've also seen, for instance, schools near some of these rice milling plants. When you travel in Tanzania, you see huge heaps of rice husks, and you would think that is a beautiful mountain, but it's waste, and they don't know how to deal with it. So rice schools in some of these communities are now using rice milling plants, getting the husks and using that to boil water for the school, prepare meals for kids, and so schools are the largest consumers of the rice husks. That said, how do we see that being measured and monitored? I think measuring and monitoring is key, right from the village level, right up to the municipalities, regional governments, local communities. All that is very key in terms of being able to track the indicator, the share of renewables as a KPI, very critical, especially when you're looking at smallholder farming households and SMEs, agro SMEs in these communities. And one can also argue and say, for instance, these are smallholder farmers, these are small enterprises, that is challenging to measure. But we could start off in a phased approach. Again, we could start with the large agro industries, go to the medium-sized one, and then phase into the small enterprises. But also, how do we see it being implemented? Incentivizing the promoters of the technologies, the users of the technologies. And we see things like tax rebates. I know governments in East Africa are now increasingly looking at increasing the tax base, and agriculture is now increasingly being looked at as an area where they can tax. And so tax rebates and tax incentives can also be something that can be promoted to be able to ensure that there's a greater uptake and usage of renewable energy in various levels. So I think as a statistician, I still believe it is really important to measure, and so the KPI is critical. but we now need to look at the competing priorities and how this can be measured at multiple levels of the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kilimo. So maybe I can turn to you now, Robin, from Energy Star. We've heard a little bit about how businesses can, raise ambition when they're connected to some kind of renewable energy performance targets, or looking at how connected to government targets on renewables with their NDCs, for example. We've heard a little bit from Dr. Burungi on how this can be tracked in the agricultural community and help drive action, but that it's important, very clearly stated, that there's also national governments, making those commitments clear. And I think that goes back to what Rana said in her presentation, that maybe this could be something that is implemented across all ministries, across all areas of economic activity. To speak a bit to Dr. Burungi's point of consistency with governments in terms of promoting renewables versus fossil fuels. You've had the experience both working previously with fossil fuels and now promoting renewables. What is your view on the KPIs and how this could perhaps raise ambition?
Thanks so much, Lily, and to Rana and your team for having me today. I just want to note that I'm coming to you from Southwest Australia, which is the home of the Noongar people, who have been in this area and taking care of this land for 60,000 years or more. And I just want to pay my respects to their elders and acknowledge that, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I feel very fortunate. Also, I want to say thanks to everyone who worked on this report and pulled everything together, and not only the team who worked on it, but all the contributors. And the fact that it's in English, I feel so spoiled to have gotten to read it in my mother tongue and to have this conversation. And so thanks to everyone who contributed. When we talk about KPIs, I'll admit I'm a little bit cynical. How do you measure? What do you measure? As both of our previous panelists have talked about, what matters. You can only have something matters if it can be measured. And so our first challenge is to say, how do we measure this and what counts? One of the things I loved about the report is that it talks about, in one of the major sidebars, about the need to figure out a way to incorporate the cost of producing things like wind turbines and solar panels and the environmental impact of the equipment that goes into renewables. Because I think one of the hardest conversations to have in my world is every time I start to talk about renewables, I get that pushback of, oh yeah, but it's just as bad because all of these other factors aren't taken into account. Of course, those interlocutors don't talk about that we also don't have ways to take into account all of the pollution and the externalities of fossil fuels. So I think it's really helpful to make sure we understand what we're measuring and how we're communicating it. And before we started the group call tonight, Dr. Burungi used a great phrase, information asymmetry. And I think that's so important because we not only have information asymmetry between the developing world and the developed world, or the rich world and the less rich world, we have so much information asymmetry within our own cultures. And partly that's because the people who produce fossil fuels have for years and years and years hired people like me, I'll admit, to go out and tell their story, to help them figure out how to influence governments and structures that exist. And it's very hard to compete with that information asymmetry. So my goal for us is that we have something like Eurovision for renewable energy ideas and sharing. And we have something like America's Got Science Talent. And we get our ideas, these kind of ideas, because there's so much out there. The question is, how do we bring it into the day-to-day mindset, not only of policymakers and politicians, but as we say, bankers, school children, people who decide what they're going to buy and how they're going to buy it and how they're going to live their lives and structure their lives. So we're working on a big thing. But the great thing about KPIs is it gets the conversation out there, and it's something we can talk about, hopefully comparing oranges to oranges, and that would be good.
Okay, that's information and symmetry. So I think the important point there that you're making is how key it is to make sure that actually the awareness is out there in the first place, right? And hopefully these KPIs can contribute to that as well, but that there needs to be additional efforts. Like you mentioned, the Eurovision for renewables, that's an idea. I think maybe I can ask you in your line of work, since you've all sort of touched on contradictions between different actors you work with and how they promote renewables, maybe you can tell me a little bit about how your sector has been successful with renewables and what most people involved in energy and climate don't seem to know or recognize about renewable energy in your line of work. And maybe Sam, I can start back with you.
So the question, what is it that, what information we don't get out, we need to get out, and what people don't recognize? Is that the
in your line of work, what's been successful in promoting renewables, right? And what has been really indeed the missing piece, but that people are not catching on renewables in your line of work?
So I think what's missing is the blindingly obvious win-win that renewables are cheaper, and this has only been the case for a couple of years. But you know, you could see the graph going downwards of the cost of renewables and the cost of gas and oil, etc., staying level or going up. And yeah, so any forward-thinking organisation can see that is happening, but it's not actually got through into policymakers' psyches, has not got through to investors' psyches, that, you know, if you're investing in coal, you're investing in a zombie industry. And I think that's really the message we need to get across loud and clear. This isn't just about being nice and fluffy and good for the environment. This is about hard economic facts. You know, gas is a bridging fuel to nowhere. It's absolutely irresponsible for oil companies to be selling gas as a bridging, you know, we need gas for developing countries to actually get a leg up. No, countries are leapfrogging and going directly to renewables because it's the cheapest option. That's the message we need to get across, not that it's good for the planet. Everybody knows it's good for the planet. Of course, there are some naysayers who think that a wind turbine doesn't pay back in more than a few weeks, which is the reality of it. But, you know, it's the economic argument that's going to play home. Job creation, economics, and also looking after communities who are currently reliant on coal. And coal is going to die. We need to look after those communities and not pretend that these castles built on sand and subsidy are going to be around forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important point. Very important point, making sure there's a just transition. And so, Dr. Birungi, what would be your take in the sector you're working in? What do you see as some of the key, what has been successful and what has been really the key blockage when you work with the people that you're working with in terms of renewables?
I think it is knowledge. But knowledge about the technologies, knowledge about the products that can provide the pathways to ensuring that, for instance, the byproducts can be used to generate energy. So, for instance, if I could just give an example again of rice, 20% of rice grain is husk, and most of the times these husks are just dumped. But in sub-Saharan Africa, we produce 18 million tons of rice a year, which means 5 million tons of rice, of husks, are produced a year. And if you translate this, it translates to 3,000 hectares of forest land cut down for firewood per year. If that can be simplified to even the simplest users in the communities, and they understand what that means in terms of knowledge, in terms of how waste can be used, I think it would be a significant route and pathway to increasing the use of renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. And Robin, what would you say is the key?
Well, I hope there's some way that this discussion can capture all of the chat's messages, because they're just brilliant, the things that people are sending in, and very succinct, concise messages that really get back to this point about the knowledge is here, we have it. And to Sam's point about, yes, it is in some places it is cheaper, in some places it ties in cheaper. Again, how do we tell that story consistently and make sure we're telling it accurately? Because there are so many people out there who want to shoot holes in these arguments, because we're breaking, I'm sorry to use the phrase, Dr. Burungi, but we want to break a lot of rice bowls. And there's going to be there is a lot of resistance. I don't have to tell you all that. The other thing to get back to in terms of how to tell a good story to business is it's not only cheaper, but, you know, as somebody who works and is still involved in oil and gas exploration, and on the other side of consumption, if you're a big company, price volatility is something that we can more or less, you know, smooth out with renewables that you cannot do with oil and gas, and to some degree coal. And so, you know, again, if we can figure out a way to consistently tell the story in ways that people can understand, any influencing strategy starts with figuring out what keeps the other person awake at night. And so whether that's high prices or concern for the environment, that's how we have to tell the story.
Okay, so just thank you so much. Before we wrap up this panel, I would like to have 30-second input from each of you. It is, as we said, the year of make it or break it this year in terms of action. What would be the one action that you would call on to try to accelerate the renewable energy transition? Sam?
Start with the low-hanging fruit, set targets for renewable electricity and implement the policies to make it happen.
Dr. Burungi?
Use technology. 650 million Africans have mobile phones. Use the technology and disseminate and increase awareness on the benefits of renewable energy.
Great. And Robin?
Just make sure we're really honest about how we're communicating. I'm one of those 47% of the new electric car owners this year, and I plug my car into the household and it's powered by diesel generators. So, you know, how do we make people fess up to what the real situation is and understand it?
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you all for joining us on this panel. So thank you, Sam, Dr. Burungi, and Robin. And now I'd like to hand over to Rana to make any final remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to the panelists and your statements, and also to everybody participating here. So I was also looking at the chat, and so like they're really, really important points. And I think like, how would I like to end? I mean, that's always a tricky part at the end. Make a short statement about very complex and diverse and rich discussions. I think I would like to end on the part that I think there have been clearly messages that technologies are there, and the technologies are there to make the change happen, but the technologies are also there to spread the messages. And here, I think from REN21's side, I would really like to acknowledge the fact that it's not only about technologies and expert discussion, but that we really need to collectively develop other skill sets in obviously shaping the policy and regulatory frameworks, making sure that we are able to measure the right things, to hold basically decision makers accountable, whether they are on track or not. I think that's really important. But the other part, and I think it's really interesting to hear Robin's input on this, is also telling the story. And I think the way you said it is like, what are people, what keep people awake at night? I think that is something which is extremely important. If we understand this, and if we're able to use the right data, the technologies, and create the markets and bring the players together to give the answers to their nightmares, I think we'll be quite far. And with regard to this, I think it's basically this community here is really showing that there is so many good stories, solutions, etc. out there. And just to build on Sam's comment, yes, low-hanging fruit, but I also think that it's really important not to repeat the error of the last 10 to 15 years and only look into the power sector, but clearly say that renewable energy power is not only there to produce the electricity, but also provide energy in end-use sectors that are rather, for the moment, building on thermal. Because the reality is that energy is everywhere, and if we'll not address it everywhere, whether it's developing industrialized countries, whether it is building industry, agriculture, the power sector, unfortunately, there will be a lot of resistance because we are competing with fuels that have established themselves as the norm for 150 years. And I look forward to pick up the challenge with all of you to make this fight happen successfully. Thank you very much.